Hello, dear viewer and learner. Welcome to your favorite program, The Knowledge Quest. History and Government Time. I am your teacher, Alex Obara. And today we shall be proceeding from where we left in our discussions last time. And if you can remember well, we discussed on the contacts between East Africa and the outside world. And we gave details that even before the coming of the colonizers or the colonial governments into Kenya or into East Africa, we still had visitors who came to the East Africa. So therefore we have those, we call them the early contacts. So it's contacts between East Africa and the outside world up to the 19th century. So 19th century backward, we had visitors who came to the East Africa. And basically we will be looking at those visitors, and we will base our discussions on what they came to do and what were their main agenda in that case, and what were the impacts. We shall be looking at both impacts on positive and negative. And therefore, I'll just give you a quick recap because this is something we discussed in our last discussion. So we will be looking at the early visitors to the East African coast up to 1500 AD. And then we shall also look at the trade between East African coast and the outside world. In that, we shall be looking at the development of that trade. We look at the organization of that trade. We look at the impact on the results or the outcome of the trade on the people of East Africa. Then after discussing on the trade, we'll move to our next discussion, which will be basing on the coming of the Portuguese. And on the Portuguese, we shall discuss on the reasons for their coming to the East African, their conquest, in other words, how they came and ruled. So their conquest and rule. And then we'll be looking at the decline of the Portuguese power. That is, after their rule, there came a time that their rule came to an end. So we'll look at the decline, and then we shall also look at the impact, or rather the results of the Portuguese rule on the East African coast. Then thereafter, we shall be looking at now the establishment or the impact of Omani rule. Now, after the Portuguese, we're having the Omani Arabs, or Omani people coming to the East African coast, and therefore we'll be looking at their establishment and then the impact of their role, basically, or precisely looking at their impact on the people of East African coast. And thereafter, we'll be looking at, after the Omani rule Arabs, we look at Said, all right, and the development of plantation agriculture, all right. So we'll be discussing into details on how plantation agriculture is and how it developed. And then thereafter we look at the development, organization, and the consequences of one, long distance trade. We'll discuss what long distance trade is. And then number two, we'll look at the international trade. And then thereafter we'll be looking at our next discussion, which will be based on the spread of Christianity. And on that case, we'll be looking at the reasons for the coming of Christian missionaries. What were the reasons why did missionaries come to the East Africa? And then we look at the missionary activities and challenges. In activities, we shall be looking at what things did they do on the boundaries or within the context of East Africa. And thereafter, we'll be looking at the effects of the missionary activities or the outcome of the missionary activities in East Africa. And therefore, I'll want to take you through a very quick recap on what we discussed last time. We discussed that the East Africa had contacts. That's the truth. It had contacts with other lands, for example, Northern Africa, Europe, Asia, for the last over 2,000 years. All right, and then we say that these early interactions with the outside world has a profound impact on the East African communities. And therefore we say now, having said that East Africa had contacts, how can we be able to verify that? That brings us to the discussion on the source of history. It brings a discussion on the source of history on East Africa. Discussing on the sources, we are basically looking at the sources of information on the history of East African. And you can remember, if your memory serves you right as my student, in Form 1, we discussed about the sources of information on history and government. And we mentioned some of these sources to be archaeological sources. We talked about oral traditions, plus many more, which you can remember. Now, in this case, we shall be looking at what were the sources of information on the coming of early visitors to the East African coast. And therefore, in this case, we shall be looking at two main sources of information on East Africa coast. And number one are the documentary. Documentaries, these are written information by different people. And then archaeological, of course, we discuss these as the remains of the material culture of human beings. So in that case, looking at the written records, we have those records which were written by visitors. In other words, there are people who came to visit East African coast, and then as they came, as they visited, they wrote some information about their contact between East Africa and the outside world, or at their contacts or their activities in East Africa. And then we also look at the inhabitants. In other words, the original dwellers of the land of East Africa also wrote some information on on the contacts of outside world and East Africa. And then now looking at those documented or documentaries or documented information, they include the following. And these ones were written by visitors to the East African coast. So the first one is called the Greco-Roman sources. The Greco-Roman sources. They are three. The first one is called the Peripterus of Erythraean Sea. That's the first one under the Greco-Roman sources. Number two, we have Ptolemy's geography. So these ones, if you go to the libraries, you can be able to locate this information of these scholars trying to explain their contacts between East Africa and the outside world. Then we have also another source called the natural history. And then we have also the Chinese sources. Okay, so the Chinese sources, of course, on this case were written by the Chinese. And then we had records written by East African inhabitants, who include the following: the Africans, the Arabs, and the Indians. So the sources written by Africans are referred to as African sources. The ones written by Arabs are called Arabic sources, and the ones written by Indians are called Indian sources. And then we also have number two, archaeological sources. And like we said, archaeological sources, these basically refer to the material remains of human culture, right? So the kind of material remains which they used, which remained after they left. They include the following: porcelain, all right? Porcelain, these are examples of some pots which were made by the Chinese specifically. Then we have coins, which were used as currency at some point. And then we have pottery, okay? Then we have beads, and then we have inscriptions on tombs dating back to about 200 BC. So those are examples of material culture, which are remains which have been discovered to be the source of information on East African coast. Then you can remember also, we now went in detail and discussed about factors which facilitated the contact between East Africa and the outside world. All right, so I'll take you through them very quickly because this was discussed. Number one, we talked about the accessibility, all right? So the East African coast was accessible because of the sea, all right? In this case, the Indian Ocean. It was easily accessible. Then number two, we talked about the monsoon winds, and we said the role of the monsoon winds was to propel, it was to push, all right, the ship, because of course by that time, technology was not so much advanced to use the kind of technology used today to propel ship. Then we have possession of advanced marine technology, for example, the making of boats and dhow, and also they also knew the art of reading maps, right, to navigate, to move through areas. Then we have good harbors. Of course, these were available in the East African coast, and they were important for anchoring of ship, all right? It was important for anchoring of ship for number one, refueling, all right? And of course, to get supplies which were important for their survival as they were proceeding with their journey. Then we have also availability of funds, okay? Funds, this basically refers to money which was important in the process. And then we looked at examples of visitors who came to the East African coast. They included the following. We had the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Arabs. Then we have people from Burma, Thailand. We have the Romans, the Chinese, the Turks, the Syrians, people from Spice Island, people from Malaysia, people from Maldives Islands, and people from Sri Lanka. So those are examples of early visitors who came to the East African coast. And then we also went further. We looked the reasons for the early visitors, and basically we went into looking at the Arabs, because we shall be looking at some trade which was basically carried out by the Arabs. And these are the reasons why the Arabs came to the East African coast. So the first reason, they came to trade, all right? In other words, to exchange what they had with what they never had, okay? Then we have spread their religion, specifically the Islamic religion, all right? Then number three, some came as refugees. That is to mean they were running away from persecution, which were basically religious persecution and political persecution, which were very common during those times. Then we have number four, to explore, all right? Their spirit of adventure, to find out new things as they were carrying out their expeditions. Then we had also to establish settlements. In other words, they came to stay, to establish their settlements and stay along the East African coast. And then we looked at the what we call the Indian Ocean trade, the trade between East Africa and the coast and the outside world, the East African coast and the outside world. And that trade is referred to as the Indian Ocean trade. And we, of course, we looked at this development. I don't want to go into details. And we saw some of the goods or commodities which were basically brought to the East Africa. And those commodities were taken out of East Africa. So the goods which were taken out of East African coast include the following. We have ivory, slaves, we have gold, we have rhinoceros horn, tortoise shells, we have copper, cinnamon, iron, beautiful skins of the leopards and other animals. We had frankincense, copper, mangrove poles, and palm oil. So these are examples of the goods which were got from the East African coast. What about the goods which were got from the outside world to East African coast? They include the following. From China, we had beautiful silks. We have porcelain bowls, all right? We had plates. Those are goods which were got from China to East African coast. Then we had goods from Persia, Syria, and Arabia to the East African coast. They include the following: beakers, bowls made of glass, okay? We have swords, daggers, tools, pots, and pans of iron. All those were got from the Arabian countries. Then we had India. From India, we had the following: metal implements, Then we have brightly colored clothes and beads. And then we had goods from the Maldives Islands. The Maldives Islands, we had cowrie shells. And of course, we'll discover that these cowrie shells were important because at some point they were used as currency. At some point they were used as currency, which you can say they were used in East Africa as currency and ornaments. And then we also had goods from Spice Island or Malacca. That include various kinds of spices. Actually, it is called Spice Island because in that island we have a lot of spices. So various kinds of spices were got from Spice Island. Then we have Burma and Thailand. The kind of goods which came from there included stone jars and pots. All right, having looked at the goods which were got from East Africa to the outside world and goods from outside world to the East African coast, now let us look at the factors which facilitated the development of this trade. And you realize the points are almost similar again. Number one, availability of trade goods. Of course, you know, trade goods are important because for trade to take place, there must be commodities for trade. Then number two, high demand. Of course, there must be demand, and then there must be supply of whatever is demanded for. So there was high demand of trade articles or goods at the East African coast and the foreign lands. Then you also had the existence of enterprising merchants. This means people who are willing to take a risk in business, all right? So they were available. They could finance, and of course, they could literally also take place in this trade. And then number 4, reason why it developed is the accessibility of the East African coast by sea, right? So East African coast is not like landlocked per se. It is accessible because we have the coastline through which the seas pass. Then we have the northeast and southwest monsoon winds, which we said, which were important in propelling of the ship. And then we have the East African coast was relatively peaceful and stable, all right? And we said for business to flourish in any place, we must have peace and we must have political stability for the well-being of business persons. And then we have the presence of deep and natural harbors. Of course, we say these ones were important for the anchoring of ship, right? For the purposes of, refueling and getting the essentials which are necessary for the journey. And then we have knowledge for technology or boat making. So there was that advanced knowledge among the Arabs, which was important for making boats and propelling them. And then we also had credit. This implies money. Credit for trading was available. It was supplied by Arab and Indian Banyans. These were rich merchants who had money in plenty, so therefore they could, give out credit to those who wanted to participate in the trade so that this trade developed further. And then number 10, we said existence of local trade. Local trade happened as a background. It gave people idea on how trade should be carried out. So they were not so green as they got into this Indian Ocean trade. So they have some information. So African communities were already familiar with trade. They had an idea of what trade is all about. Having looked at that, we discussed on the organization. I'll not go into details because I want us to move into what we'll be discussing today. We looked at the impact of the Indian Ocean trade on the people of East Africa. And I want you to note we are discussing about the impact or the results, all right? And the impacts can always be classified into two. We have positive and negative. So we'll be looking at the positive impact on the people of East Africa, and thereafter we also discuss on the negative impact. So the positive impact include the following. Number 1, Islamic culture spread along the coast of East Africa, all right? So there was the borrowing. That's a good thing when there's borrowing of good culture. Of course, there's some culture which is not very good. So there was spread of good culture along the East African coast. Then number 2, there were intermarriages between the foreigners and the local communities. Also, that is good because it improves what we call cohesiveness and interdependence and staying together. So there was intermarriages between foreigners or people came from outside and the local communities, and specifically the Bantus who lived along the coast. And then number 3, we talk about emergence of Kiswahili. And I said that Kiswahili is not a product of intermarriages. Kiswahili is enriched as a result of interactions. Therefore, it meant that Kiswahili existed as a Bantu language, but as a result of interactions, there were some words which were borrowed from Arabic, all right? And as a result, Kiswahili as a language developed further. And then there was also the spread of Islamic religion to the East Africa, okay? Religion also is a good thing because it enables people to identify their God. Now, the question we'll ask ourselves is, if Islamic religion spread in the East African coast or the East Africa, what factors facilitated or encouraged the spread of Islam in the East African coast? So that's what we're looking at, factors that encouraged the spread of Islam in East Africa by 1500. So they include the following. I'll mention them very quickly. Number 1, intermarriages, all right? Number 2, Arab migration and settlement along the East African coast. Number 3, development of commercial trading activities. Then number 4, we have the Islam appealed to the local people because of the idea that they did not discourage the African traditions which were so much embedded in the communities, including polygamy. Africans happen to be polygamous, and the Islamic religion supported polygamy, and therefore Africans embraced the religion. Number 5, development of Kiswahili as a mode of communication between the foreigners and the people of East African coast. So therefore it was easy to pass their religion because communication was easier as a result of development of Kiswahili as a mode of communication. And then another factor is the opening up of madrasa. Madrasa, it refers to, those areas where young children, men and women, of course, are taught about Islam religion, okay? So they were able to be taught the Islamic education. That also facilitated the spread of Islam. Then we also have some local East African traders became converted in order to improve their trading links. There are those who were tactical in nature, in that they wanted to gain religion, to gain back, and in other words, to be able to carry out trade. So therefore, they were able to improve their trading links with Muslim traders. Number 8, some East African people were converted in order to avoid being captured as slaves. Why? Because Islam forbade enslavement of fellow Muslims. In other words, these Arabs were participating in slave trade. However, they did not capture fellow Muslims. So most Africans converted to become Muslims so as not to be involved or to be captured as slaves, because the religion could not allow a fellow Muslim being captured as a slave. And therefore, the Islamic culture spread along the East African coast, and this was characterized by the following. It was characterized by the following. Number 1, Asiatic architecture. This refers to the kind of infrastructure and buildings. And if you go to the East African coast, you realize most of the buildings there are dome-shaped. That is Asiatic architect. Then we have new ways of dressing using the kanzus, all right? And of course, on the ladies, they use clothes like the dera and the hijab. Those are kinds of dress which were introduced as a result of the interaction. Then we have new ways of cooking and eating, and the introduction of the Sharia and the Islamic law. So my dear student, I will want us to go for a short break. We are coming shortly, and as we come shortly, we shall be looking at the next impact of the Indian Ocean trade on the people of East Africa. See you shortly. You meet with somebody who has a commodity you want, you show some signs, all right? And in that process, you exchange. So we say in the earlier days, trade was conducted on the basis of barter system. That is, exchanging goods for goods. And the transaction became more complicated, which needed the use of currency, all right? It became complicated because of the several reasons. Number 1, it was not easy to measure the value of a commodity and another commodity. And then there was also the issues of lack of double coincidence, all right? So you have a commodity and you want a certain commodity. For example, you have banana, you need a goat. And you can't find somebody who has a goat and eats banana. So that's lack of double coincidence. And then therefore, as a result of those challenges, they developed cowrie shells, which became widely used. And later, the Arabs and Persians introduced metal coins. And some of the coastal towns, for example, Mogadishu, Kilwa, they also minted their own coins. In other words, they came up with their own coins up to around 1500 AD in order to ease commercial transactions. So you realize the idea of using currency or money in that case is an idea which came as a result of this trade, all right? And therefore, you realize that those were the positive impacts. Now let's look at the negative impact of this Indian Ocean trade. The negative impact of the Indian Ocean trade. They include the following. Number 1, there was decline of local industries. Decline of local industries refers, or this means that people now preferred local international goods or foreign goods as opposed to the local. So talk about the goods like daggers, knives, hoes, and jembes, of course, which were brought from outside, which were more refined and which were more, sophisticated in their use, and therefore the local industries declined. all right, because people preferred goods from outside which were more refined. Then there was also destruction or destroying of wildlife in the interior of East Africa. Why? Because in this case, people needed ivory and they needed those horns from rhinoceros. So as a result, you realize that most animals were killed in the quest, on the quench to, get more commodity or get more trade goods in the process. And therefore, those became the negative. Then number three, there was intensification of intercommunity warfare, all right? This was as a result of slave trading, all right? I told you initially that Arabs at some point were slave traders, and therefore people could carry out raids. In other words, they go to community B or community A and try to steal people from that community to be used as commodities in the slave trade. And therefore, as a result of that, it led to the widespread of suffering. People suffered. There was fear. There was insecurity. There was loss of property, starvation, separation of families, underdevelopment of hinterland. Hinterland refers to those areas from whence the slaves were, raided from. There was depopulation. In other words, population reduced from the interior. The able-bodied were captured as slaves. And you refer, because these slaves were used as commodities, the ones which were specifically preferred were those who were able-bodied men and women in that case. So therefore, there was depopulation. And then eventually, this led to colonization, all right? How did this lead to colonization? Because the interior of East Africa was exposed to the East African or to the outside world in that case. And therefore, this led to the coming of foreigners who eventually colonized the region. In other words, I'm saying that as the Arabs, traders and other traders and the Persians were carrying out the trade, they in some way exposed East African coast to the outside world. And therefore, that led to attraction. And because of this attraction, more foreigners came, and those foreigners eventually became the colonizers of East Africa as a result. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is what we can say about the Indian Ocean or trade, or the development of the Indian Ocean trade. There, the commodities used, the goods got from inside and outside, and the impacts, both local and both positive and negative. And therefore, now that brings us to our next discussion, which you said, as a result of this trade, East African coast was exposed to other foreigners. And among those foreigners to whom East Africa was exposed includes the Portuguese, all right? So therefore, that led to the coming of the Portuguese as a result of that trade. So therefore, you realize that a brief introduction that Portugal is a small country in southwest Europe. It's located in the Iberian Peninsula. And by the 15th century, it was the leading sea power in Europe. In other words, by the 1500 AD, Portugal, or the Portuguese, was so much into exploring and into, finding out more about the sea. Therefore, they became the leading sea power in Europe. And of course, you realize that changed with the time, as we'll be discussing in history. And the Portuguese started to engage in voyages, that is to travel around the world, so as to discover a number of things. So there are factors that made the Portuguese to embark on voyages of discoveries and exploration. What are some of the factors which enabled, or rather which encouraged the Portuguese to embark, in other words, to participate in voyages of discoveries and exploration? Voyages that travels, and these travels were basically through water. So what are some of the factors that encourage them? Number one, existence of able and competent leaders, all right? These competent leaders encouraged the Portuguese to participate in exploring the world, all right? And their motto was going to out and to conquering and to conquer and to discover. And therefore, examples of those competent leaders included Prince Henry the Navigator. Actually, it's called Prince Henry the Navigator because of his passion in navigating and finding out more about the world. Prince Henry the Navigator lived between the year 1394 to 1460. And then also another factor which encouraged or which made the Portuguese to embark on voyages of discoveries and exploration is the geographical location of Europe. So if you go to your map or to your atlases, you'll be able to see that it is located in a place that is favorable, which enabled her to be a pioneer in voyages of exploration. It was located, or it is still located in the map, in a place where it is able to move easily around the world. So the geographical position of the Portugal in the European map, or actually in the world. Then number 3, the Portuguese had expelled Muslim invaders from her country, and therefore this enabled her to turn her attention elsewhere. This is what we mean, that before they began the explorations, there are some Muslim invaders who had invaded Portugal. Therefore, Portugal was able to fight them and defeat them and drive them out of their country. So after driving them out of their country, their attention now was not on those Muslims, but elsewhere. And that elsewhere was traveling around the world. Then number 4, France and Spain were engaged in warfare. All right? France and Spain were engaged in warfare. This diverted their attention from voyages of discovery. You realize these two countries, that is France and Spain, are among the very powerful countries, or were among the very powerful countries then. But the reason why Portugal is coming out very strongly is because the main concentration of France and Spain was on war. It was on fighting. And therefore, as a result, Portugal took advantage of that. It took advantage of that, and therefore it went out and explored and did more voyages. And then another point I want us to realize, that Portugal was undergoing a period of peaceful a period of peace. It was undergoing a period of peace, resulting in an increasing population. Ladies and gentlemen, where there is peace, people always are they tend to work harder, and they tend to focus more on issues of development. So as that, there was increase in population, and therefore there was need to go out and explore more. And another reason, the last one in this case, is that Portugal is not very well much endowed with natural resources. In other words, Portugal as a country do not have a lot of minerals, okay? And therefore, as that, they had to look for more resources, or for more areas from whence they could get the minerals. Therefore, that made them to extend their survey, or their movement outside Portugal, so as to find more minerals. Having looked at those factors, now I want us to look at the factors or the reasons for their coming to Africa. Generally, we've looked at reasons why they were enterprising in as far as moving on seas is concerned, in as far as exploring and finding new places is concerned. But now the question is, why did the Portuguese come to specifically East Africa? Why did they come to East Africa specifically? So number 1, Portugal had the desire to control the east of Africa and dominate the trade. Remember, we said initially that East Africa as a country had been exposed. East Africa had been exposed to the outside world. And having been exposed to the outside world, Portugal had an idea. Portugal had an idea of how East Africa is. And therefore, they had the desire to come and control and dominate on that trade. Okay? So the first point is they had a desire to control the east coast of Africa and dominate trade. Number 2, they were seeking for maritime or sea route to India. Okay? So they were finding their way or a sea route to India. When we talk about maritime or sea route to India, we'll be discussing into detail why India is important in this case. So they were trying to find out what is the sea route. How can they find out where India is specifically located. And as they were moving, finding their way through to India, they discovered Africa. And therefore, they were able now to make a dwelling or a settlement in East Africa specifically. Number 3, they had the spirit of exploration and adventure. That means that they were also very much concerned, they also had the desire to move out, explore, and find out new things. And therefore, this was due to the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, we'll realize that we have what we call the Dark Ages. So after the Dark Ages, there was a rebirth of knowledge. So people were so much, people were so much interested in discovering things, getting more knowledge about the world and around the world. So therefore, as a result of that, they had the desire to explore and adventure and discover knowledge. And then number 4, they also wanted to spread Christianity. Remember, the Arabs were the first to settle in East Africa, and they have settled there. They have tried to spread their religion, Islam. And the Portuguese, realizing that, they also came and said they wanted to come and counter the spread of Islam. And on that, they also spread their religion and influence. Okay? So that also became another reason why they came, okay? To counter the spread of religion of Islam and, in essence, to spread their religion, in this case, which was Christianity. And then also, they wanted to form an anti-Muslim alliance, okay? They wanted to form an anti-Muslim alliance. Remember, of course, in this case, Muslims were viewed by Africans, more so those who were in the hinterland, the interior. They viewed Muslims as bad people because they carried out slave trade. So therefore, they came and formed anti-Muslim alliance to counter and also to control the spread of slave trade. And then the last one, in this case, which we'll be looking here, is they came to make contact with the legendary Christian king known as Prester John. All right, so they were finding out, they had heard about Prester John. All right, so they came to make contact with this legendary Christian king called Prester John, for he was said to rule part of the interior of Northeast Africa. So they wanted to know, who is this legendary king referred to as Prester King? And they heard that apart from ruling where he was, he also ruling part of North and East Africa. And therefore, as a result, in their quest, of course, to find out this king, they discovered East Africa and they were able to control. Also, the coast of East Africa was of strategic importance to the Portuguese. It was important for the Portuguese, and it could serve them in various ways. All right. Number 1, it could help them or be a base for resisting. Okay, so the Portuguese, at that time they were trying, of course, at some point to control the world. So it could happen, East Africa would be of strategic importance to assist them to resist any kind of attack from any force which would want to resist or which would want to, control the world. And then it was also important for refueling their ship. And how is this important? We talked about the harbors, all right? We talked about the East African coast having natural harbors, which were very good for purposes of docking the ship. Therefore, it was important for them to refuel their ship along the East African coast, even as they keep on moving on other parts of the world to discover. And then it was also important for replenishing their supplies as they were moving to India. All right? It was important for replenishing. Yeah? This also still emphasizes on the importance of the natural harbors. So it was important for replenishing and their supplies as they were moving to India. And then it also would act as a station for their naval patrols, that is to safeguard their merchant ships. So it will have like a point of the navy, right? Those soldiers who patrol along the sea and all that. So it was of naval importance because they could be able to safeguard their merchant ships which were moving along the waters. And also, the next point is that the Portuguese wanted to establish a commercial empire and to have the largest share in the Eastern trade. All right, so they wanted to establish an empire which was great. And apart from that great, they wanted also to control, all right, and have the largest share in the Eastern trade. And therefore, as a result, you realize that they were able to, come to the East African coast. So having looked at that, we'll now be able to discuss and see how they conquered the East African coast and how they were able to establish their role after conquering the East African coast. And you realize that the conquest of the coast, of the East African coast, was mainly done through expeditions. Or rather, we can say that they were sending some soldiers who could come, eventually do out the attack, and then other ones will be sent in, in different categories. So the conquest of the East African coast was done through expeditions which were conducted by the Portuguese. And these expeditions were done at different stages. In other words, it was done at different years. So the first one was done in the year 1487 to 1491. That is the first expedition. And this one was led by Pedro da Covilla, all right? Pedro da Covilla traveled to the east to gather information. That is the first expedition. Remember, we've said that this African coast the conquest was done through what? Expeditions, which were conducted by the Portuguese. So the first expedition is 1487 to 1491. And this one was led by Pedro de Covilla. And he traveled to East Africa to gather information. So it was like he was carrying out a reconnaissance to go and spy and get information and then take back to the mother country. And then in the year 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz, he also moved around the Cape of Good Hope to East Africa, all right? And also in that case also, he was able to gather information about the East African coast and how it was a rich ground for them to go explore and of course establish their role. In the year 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. Okay, this was a treaty which was actually linking the East African coast and Portuguese. And this treaty kept other European powers away. Okay, so it was a treaty which was meant to keep other European powers away from accessing East Africa, except the Portuguese. So you see, these expeditions are taking place one after another, and they're trying to entrench their rule, and eventually we will realize that they will be able to establish their role. So we are going to wind up our lesson at that point today. We'll finish at that point, having looked at the first expedition, the second and the third. So we'll be looking at the fourth, fifth onwards in our next discussion, and later we shall be able to see how the Portuguese were able to conquer the East African coast. So that marks the end of our lesson for today. Keep yourself safe, and may we see each other in our next lesson, even as God takes care of you. Goodbye.